Bishop Simon Bruté lecture. Our lecturer this year is Dr. Gary Anderson, who is Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Studies and also Professor of Old Testament at Notre Dame. Dr. Anderson got his MA at Duke University and then his PhD at Harvard University in their Department of Near Eastern Languages and Literature. His first job in the mid-'80s was to teach at the University of Virginia. He taught there for about 10 years. In the middle of that time, he was received into the Catholic Church after a rather long journey. Then, after 10 years at University of Virginia, he went to Harvard and taught Old Testament there at Harvard. Then, in 2003, he went to Notre Dame and has been teaching there since then. His lecture tonight is based on a book he wrote, published in 2013, called Charity, the Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition. So it's kind of arising out of that he's speaking tonight, and let's give him a warm Marian welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's my pleasure to be here. Let me maybe just make a couple of remarks before jumping into my paper per se. I did circulate a handout. I suppose it's not absolutely necessary, but I think it will be useful for following some of the finer points that I'd like to make this evening. On the first page, you'll see the text that will be the principal subject of my remarks tonight, the story as it's commonly known, the rich young man. He's not identified as a young man in this story, but as a placeholder, we'll use that, the rich young man. And specifically the advice that Jesus gives to this young man to give all of his money to the poor, and then the important motivational clause, you shall have treasure in heaven. We're going to see how this story in chapter 10 can be illuminated, and this will come near the end of the lecture, by comparing it to the story in Mark 8, in which Jesus questions the disciples about his personal identity. And in order to understand why those two stories should be correlated, I think it's useful to place these stories within the larger narrative ambit of the Gospel of Mark, and that's on page 2. Specifically, the section that many modern biblical scholars identify as the travel narrative, the story that begins around the middle of chapter 8, with St. Peter's confession of Jesus as Messiah at Caesarea Philippi, perhaps the northernmost reach of the area of Galilee, and a narrative then that will conclude at the very beginning of chapter 11 with Jesus' entrance into the city of Jerusalem. So it's called the travel narrative because over the course of this narrative, Jesus is going from a spot about as far from Jerusalem as he ever was to the city of Jerusalem. Then what's significant about this narrative is Jesus' attempts to instruct his disciples about his own identity. The disciples in Mark are decidedly in the dark about who Jesus is. They don't really get it even at the end of the gospel. It's only after the resurrection that the disciples are illuminated. But this story of the travel narrative is going to be punctuated by 3 different predictions of the Passion. Each one of these predictions of the Passion is going to be met with a large question mark on the part of the disciples. And that's one of the reasons it's so important in this narrative to notice its structure, both how it begins and ends, which are with stories of Jesus healing blind men. And that nicely illumines what's going on in the middle of the narrative, is Jesus trying to heal spiritual blindness. He's more successful with the physical blindness than the spiritual blindness. But we'll attend to that, why it is that the story of the rich young man is found within the travel narrative and the place at which it's found, which is right next to the very last prediction of the Passion. So that explains the handout. And I have these first two slides I want to say a couple of things about because I think they nicely illustrate as well as central thesis of my lecture tonight, as well as my book in general. And that is the way in which charity to the poor, is correlated with service, typically altar service of God. And that is nicely illustrated in this. This is from a Liturgy of the Hours, probably about 1400. That is the late Middle Ages. And on the right-hand side there, you can see a man seated on the ground receiving alms as a beggar. And then directly diagonally from that upper left-hand corner, you can see a priest raising the Eucharistic host. Looking at this image, you can't help, or I couldn't help, be struck by an image that's common within early Christian writers. St. John Chrysostom, for example, who in a number of homilies would tell his parishioners that during Mass they met Christ at the altar, and then he urged them to go out in the street and meet Christ in the many living altars of the streets of Antioch. So that charity in classical patristic Christianity, and as well as high medieval Catholic Christianity, had a quasi-sacramental sensibility about it. It wasn't, of course, one of the 7 sacraments. That's not what I mean. But it was a privileged religious act in which one's meeting of Christ was comparable to the meeting of Christ in the Eucharist. And we can see this illustrated very nicely in my second slide here, which is also an illuminating slide for a different set of reasons. I think in the modern world, charity to the poor is understood more or less on purely socioeconomic, or what I often refer to as simply horizontal grounds. That is, as an action that's between two human agents, the one who's, of course, providing the help and the recipient of the help. In this image, you'll see Joachim there. He has obviously identified by the halo around his head. He's handing bread to paupers, not unlike the scene of the almsgiving in the image from the Book of Hours we just looked at. But strikingly, I saw this in the National Gallery of Art a few years back. I was there with my wife just prior to the March for Life, and I love to go into art museums, especially go into the medieval section to see how biblical scenes are depicted as evidence of biblical interpretation. One of the things that's often struck me over the years is how poorly one is guided in an art museum by the description of the painting, and sometimes even the title. And this is a very poor title, Joachim and the Beggars. Well, we just saw Joachim and the Beggars, that's true. But what's important to notice in this picture, certainly for Andrea de Bartolo of Siena, just as important as Joachim, is Anna, who stands immediately to the right of Joachim. In fact, there's a great English expression I'm sure you're all familiar with, to be joined at the hip. That is to be so closely allied with an individual, another individual, that you essentially consist of being one actor. I think that's the sense we see here in this picture with Anna and Joachim side by side there with their heads facing in different directions. Anna there is directing a gift of grain to the priest in the temple. So here we see a nice correlation, just as we did in that previous image, of service to altar matched by service to the poor. And in patristic medieval and Judaism of Jesus' day, this was the standard way of looking at the charitable act, of seeing it not simply on a horizontal frame as an act that consists of a human giver and a human recipient, but as an act that somehow involves God as a direct participant, something that's fallen out, I think, of our modern understandings of charity, but very important to bear in mind as we look at the biblical material. So that, by way of kind of preliminary introduction, let me begin with my lecture proper. So I mentioned here what we want to see here with this vertical dimension is the supernatural character of the charitable act. And perhaps the best place I'd like to suggest for exploring the supernatural character of the virtue of charity is the story of the rich young man. In this story, Jesus commends the piety of this young man, but urges him to take one step further. Go sell what you own, Jesus suggests. Give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Though these words can still register amazement, their familiarity, though, often poses a challenge. We as modern readers often become inured to the radical implications of this text. Indeed, what strikes the modern hearer as odd is not so much what Jesus demands, sell what you own, but rather the reward that Jesus attaches to this action. You will have treasure in heaven. I remember one time when I was lecturing on this subject in Boston, a very learned priest told me that after Mass once, while preaching on this text, a parishioner had asked him why Jesus, in fact, had included this clause, you'll have treasure in heaven. Shouldn't Jesus have simply said, go sell what you own and give the money to the poor, and stopped there? By appending this motivational clause, you'll have treasure in heaven, this parishioner sensed that the necessary condition of a moral act had been fatally compromised. After all, a charitable deed ought to be grounded simply in the concern for the other, and not spoiled by any scent of self-interest. Now, on the face of it, this is a formidable critique and a difficult question to answer. The concern for selfless acts of charity has been at the heart of Christian theology from the very start. But somewhat surprisingly, this particular text didn't register the same level of anxiety among patristic audiences, for example, as it does among modern ones. The concept of a heavenly treasury has become something of an embarrassment to modern persons. Now, a little bit embarrassed by this next slide because it will include words of praise for my book, but I wasn't so embarrassed I wouldn't include it, so I guess it gives me something else to ask for forgiveness for during Lent. I think it nicely illustrates what the problem is with this category, treasury in heaven. From Peter Brown's most recent book, Ransom of the Soul, he writes, when one turns to present-day scholarship on this question, we find that the idea of a treasure in heaven is surrounded by a loud silence. Neither in the Catholic Dictionnaire de la Spiritualité nor in the Protestant Theologische Real Encyclopédie is there an entry on trésor, the French word for treasury, nor Schatz, the German word for the same. And then his words of praise for my book. We won't attend to that. At present, what's important, we'll come to this slide, we'll hold that slide for a second. What's important to notice is that the category itself has been ignored in modern theological scholarship, in spite of the fact that it is perhaps the most important category, as Peter Brown's 500-page book on the subject is nicely shown, for early Christian writers and thinkers with respect to charity. And that difficulty is really exactly what I want to thematize this evening. One of the reasons I want to suggest that modern readers focus so much attention on the altruism of the rich young man is that we tend to view charity in this simply horizontal fashion. It's as if the only players to be considered are the donor and the donee. And if that's the case, then two concerns obviously rise to center stage: the motivation of the donor and the effectiveness of the donation. The latter concern raises, of course, the important question of how our charitable efforts contribute to the creation of a more just society. An extremely important dimension of charity, but sometimes this interest simply in social justice leads to folding of charity both in secular and ecclesial discourse into social justice discourse without any remainder. Now, I should emphasize this evening that my point is not to impugn social justice, far from it. It's clearly a non-negotiable element in the Church's social teaching. But because social justice as a category is primarily concerned with the equitable distribution of the finite goods of this world, it can't capture the crucial sacramental role charity also plays in the Christian life. Charity, I want to contend this evening, must be understood along both a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. And it's this vertical dimension that has largely fallen out of our theological imaginations and constitutes, I'd want to suggest, the major reason why Jesus' motivational clause has become something of a stumbling block to the modern reader. In order to appreciate why charity has this vertical dimension, it'd be useful to look again at the origins of this concept of a treasury in heaven within the Old Testament. I'd like to suggest that perhaps a close reading of these texts from which this image emerges will enlarge a portion of our theological imagination that is greatly atrophied. So now on to the text I had initially pointed us to, Proverbs chapter 10, verse 2. Treasures of wickedness provide no benefit, but righteousness delivers from death. The key detail to note in this proverb is the opposition between provides no benefit and delivers from death, as I have indicated in the red. Clearly, the worry here is how to avoid some tragic event that could be encountered in the future. I should hasten to add here that in the book of Proverbs, we don't yet have surfaced in biblical thought the notion of a bodily resurrection. Accordingly, we should understand then the phrase delivers from death as referring to the experience of salvation from a this-worldly calamity, such as a terrible illness, or perhaps the premature death of one's beloved children, as we see in the Joseph story in the book of Genesis, or the infirmity of old age. Indeed, this last example captures, I think, the sense of the proverb best and puts a fine point on the radical character of its teaching. Let me give perhaps a slightly modern paraphrase to capture the pungency of this proverb. However confident you might be in the funds you've accumulated in your IRA for retirement, in the end, they won't provide the help you might expect. Well, one might ask, if my financial assets are of negligible value, then on what should I rely? To answer this question, we need to attend to the opposition here in this proverb between righteousness and wickedness. In the book of Proverbs, these two words constitute a natural antinomy. And any proper interpretation of the proverb must be able to explain what is the specific type of opposition that's implied between our A and B lines. And here we must make one additional observation, and that's this. In the Hebrew of Jesus' own day, the Hebrew word for righteousness had taken on the technical sense of charity to the poor. With these points in mind, we could paraphrase our proverb this way. The treasury of wickedness provides no benefit, but charity to the poor will deliver from death. The next question then we might want to ask is, how are we to understand these treasures of wickedness? Oh, thank you so much. You read my mind. My goodness. You're a saint in waiting. Where's your halo? Those who provide drink to the thirsty will be greatly rewarded, according to Matthew 25. Okay. The next question, okay, as I mentioned here, concerns the treasures of wickedness. Modern translations often render this phrase, treasuries gained by wickedness. Now, grammatically, this is certainly possible. It doesn't offend in any sense the Hebrew that underlies it. The problem with it is it doesn't provide a very good antonym for the concept of charity. And to understand this proverb correctly, it's not a matter of simply asking what are the ways to understand treasures of wickedness on its own, but we need to have an understanding of that phrase that in the end is going to provide a nice antonym to the B line, charity to the poor. I would like to suggest that rather than focusing on how the wealth was accumulated, which is much more a concern of modern thinkers than ancients, it would be better to focus on what the wealth was capable of doing. This was much more the interest of the pre-modern person and reflects, and hence the topic of my lecture, a metaphysical concern. What is money in the end, and what can money or saved assets in the end really do? What are its metaphysical properties? One might think, this proverb presumes, that saving money for the future will allow one to navigate safely the uncertainties of what the future might reveal. And there's a certain obvious truth to that. The financial industry, brokerage houses, so on and so forth, wouldn't survive if there wasn't an element of truth to that element. But our proverb, at least momentarily, wants to reject that common sense notion. Our proverb wants to maintain that the only thing that you can truly count on in the end are not the monies that you've saved, but rather the monies that you've given away to the poor and the suffering. At this point, we can paraphrase our proverb this way. The goods that you hoard in your bank account, your IRA, or what have you, won't provide the benefit you expect. Rather, only charity to the poor will deliver you from future difficulties. Okay, we're almost ready to return to our gospel lection. But just one more detail remains to be examined. As is frequent in Hebrew poetry, an idea that's expressed clearly in the A line has to be carried down almost unconsciously into the B line. Let me give you a great example of this from Psalm 100. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. In this case, the reader must carry the subject of the A line, or the object, all the earth, down to the B line, where it's the presumed but unexpressed subject of the verb worship. Worship, that is, all the earth, the Lord with gladness. Presume that we take that down to the B line to fill it out. The same thing I want to suggest should be done with respect to our proverb here. The goods that you hoard in treasuries, this mention of treasuries in the A line suggests that there may be treasuries involved also in the B line. And if we presume that, then we could easily then provide this paraphrase. The goods you hoard in earthly treasuries, those provide no benefit, but heavenly treasuries funded by your charity, those will in fact deliver from death. Now, this is a very plausible, of course, rendering of how this proverb can be understood, but what's the proof that people in Jesus' own day read it that way? Well, we can find proof of it in a near contemporary, wrote about maybe a couple of centuries before Jesus, a writer known as Ben Sira, Ecclesiasticus. He goes by, the book goes by different titles. And in this book, we see Ben Sira saying this: lay up your treasure according to the commandments of the Most High, and it will profit you more than gold. Notice this profit you more than gold certainly reflects what we saw in our proverb just before. Earthly treasuries won't profit you. Gold won't profit you. What will profit you? Laying up a different kind of treasure. How do you fund that treasury? You fund that treasury by storing up almsgiving in it. So we can see very nicely within Ben Sira 29 that he's read this proverb very much along the lines that I have suggested. We have a contrast of two different sorts of treasuries. The treasury we all know, the bank account that we stuff with earthly wealth, but the other kind of bank account that Proverbs wants to instruct us about and that Ben Sira makes quite clear in this proverb is your heavenly bank account, the bank account that's truly trustable. And this bank account can only be funded by your charity, whereas gold will provide very little profit. It is this treasury funded by your almsgiving that will rescue you from every disaster. What's important to note here is the counterintuitive character of what our proverb teaches. One might have thought, as I suggested earlier, that a safe future could only be guaranteed by storing up earthly wealth. But note the way this common sense understanding is radically inverted by our proverb. Our proverb contends that the only wealth that's truly reliable is that which you acquire through charitable action. The teaching, I think we could say from the perspective of the New Testament, is through and through Christological. The way to true security is through giving away exactly those goods which the world esteems as providing security. Well, with these thoughts in mind, I think we're prepared to return to our gospel. But this time, let's step back and take a look at how the story of the rich young man is situated in the literary context of the gospel as a whole, something I alluded to at the beginning of my talk. Mark chapter 10, the story of the rich young man, is part of what modern biblical scholars have called the travel narrative. It documents, as I mentioned, the final trip Jesus makes from the Galilee to Jerusalem. The narrative is framed, as I said, by two stories of blind men being healed, and those stories nicely set up the central theme of the travel narrative itself, which is the spiritual blindness of the disciples about who Jesus is. The narrative begins, chapter 8, and this is the bottom of page 1 of your handout, with the famous story in which Jesus poses a question to his disciples, who do you say that I am? In fact, this is a good text for today. This is the chair of St. Peter, and this is, of course, the text in Matthew's Gospel where Peter's future office will be spoken of. But in any event, we're going to stay with Mark. Who do you say that I am? And Peter provides then the correct answer. You are the Messiah. Jesus then informs the disciples of what it means to be the Messiah of Israel. And here we get the first prediction of the Passion. There's going to be 3 of them in Mark's Gospel. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and scribes, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Peter famously rejects this definition that Jesus has provided and is rebuked in astonishingly harsh terms. Get behind me, Satan, Jesus says, for you are setting your mind not on divine, but on human things. The scene closes with Jesus gathering both the disciples and the crowd that have assembled and clarifying what the gospel really means. Near the end of this section, Jesus says, if anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. You want to acquire wealth, you give it away, right? We talked about the Christological sensibility here. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. This message, of course, is counterintuitive, to say the least. Just as Jesus will save Israel by dying on the cross, so those who wish to follow him will only save their lives by losing them first. Now, Jesus will repeat this prediction of the Passion 2 other times in the travel narrative. These predictions of the Passion punctuate this central portion of Mark's Gospel. The second prediction reads almost like the first in chapter 9, but even on a second hearing, the disciples are not any wiser. When Jesus was teaching his disciples, the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, so on and so forth. But then verse 32, they did not understand what he was saying, but at least they had learned the first time when they saw what happened to Peter, so they're not going to ask Jesus about it. It just says they were afraid to ask him, as if to put an exclamation point on the level of ignorance. I should say, and as if to put an exclamation point on the ignorance in verse 32, the next story that's appended is really quite incredible. Mark informs us here in verses 33 to 35 that the disciples began to argue about who is the greatest. The fact that the disciples are worrying about their own prestige and glory shows that they are continuing to make the same type of mistake that Peter made in chapter 8. The messianic office, as Jesus is trying to instruct his disciples, is not about power over others. The cruciform character of the gospel is lost on the disciples. Jesus closes this episode with words that recall what he said after the first prediction of the Passion. Whoever wishes to be first, verse 35, must be last of all and servant of all. This kind of reverse economy, which is so basic to the way in which Jesus wants to define the gospel. The third prediction of the Passion in chapter 10 is the longest and most detailed, but it too, strikingly, falls on ignorant ears. At the conclusion of this prediction, James and John turn to Jesus and ask whether they can be seated to the right and left of him in glory. Another not-so-veiled claim for status and power. Jesus, in surprise at this request, replies, "You don't know what you're asking for. The only way to acquire such an honor is to drink the cup that Jesus will drink and be baptized with his baptism," both veiled allusions to his pending crucifixion. In sum, what we see in these three predictions of the Passion is a terse summary of Jesus' understanding of himself as the Messiah of Israel and the utter inability of the disciples to grasp the point. True, Jesus has attached the right title to Jesus' person. You are the Messiah. But both he and the rest of the disciples in Mark's Gospels are shockingly ignorant of its cruciform content. What our writer wants to say is that true knowledge of who Jesus is can only occur after the resurrection, when the Holy Spirit will fill the hearts and minds of the disciples. Only revelation, not human ingenuity, will disclose the identity of Jesus. Well, with this in mind, let's turn back to the story of the rich young man. As we've already noted, the concept of a treasury in heaven that Jesus introduces in this story is not a throwaway line. It's grounded in Proverbs 10 and echoes an important Christological theme found throughout this section. If you want to prepare for the unknown events of the future, don't accumulate earthly wealth, rather give it away. True wealth will be acquired by giving away what the world esteems as wealth. But the rich man, as we saw in this story, just like the disciples, when Jesus defines his own person, couldn't bear the message. The disciples, too, found the teaching difficult. After the rich man had left, Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "Children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." They were greatly astounded and said to one another, "Then who can be saved?" And Jesus looked at them and said, "For mortals it's impossible, but not for God. For God all things are possible." What's striking about this interchange is that it mirrors, in very important ways, what's happening in the larger frame of the travel narrative itself. The story of the rich young man, I'd like to suggest, is something like a play within a play. If you're familiar with how that might work, for example, in Shakespeare's works, where in a certain scene in very short scope, he'll introduce minor characters who will enact in very short compass all of the themes that are whirling about in the larger form of the play. What I'd like to suggest is that's exactly what we see here in the Gospel of Mark. The dominant theme of the travel narrative is the counterintuitive character of the Gospel and the inability of the disciples to grasp it. Peter thinks that being the Messiah of Israel is all about power and glory. Jesus presumably will shortly destroy his Roman enemies and the kingdom of God will promptly begin. The disciples, we might imagine, have evidently signed on to this mission in part because they wish to enjoy the future spoils that this king will be able to distribute. Try as Jesus might to alert the disciples to the fact that any promise of future glory will demand death on a cross, he's not successful. And similarly for our rich young man, he comes to Jesus asking to be instructed about how to acquire eternal life. Jesus responds that such a reward will require giving up all his earthly wealth. The lesson that we saw in Proverbs 10:2 perfectly illustrates the problem that besets this man. Eternal life will not come from human riches. Only divine riches can bestow such a blessing. And the means of acquiring those divine riches is cruciform in nature. Worldly wealth must be renounced. Well, now we're prepared, I think, to address the question I opened with. Modern readers have found this story puzzling because of Jesus' promise of a reward. What about the altruistic character of the moral act? Hasn't Jesus compromised it by attaching this reward? But as I mentioned, the problem with altruism is that it foregrounds the horizontal dimension of the charitable act. The crucial variable in this horizontal dimension becomes simply the subjective demeanor of the giver of the goods himself. But the shocking demand Jesus makes in this story is meant to recall what Jesus has already revealed about his own vocation and that of his disciples. That is, the point here is that in order to gain your life, you must lose them. Well, if we can grant that the teaching of Jesus about the cross mirrors his teaching about wealth, then concerns about altruism that seem so natural when we're talking about giving away wealth ought to be transferable to the former. That is, Jesus' teaching about the cross. In other words, if we're really against this notion of rewards, and we would prefer, for example, that Jesus would say something like this: if you lack one thing, sell what you own, give the money to the poor, then come and follow me, then shouldn't we also want Jesus to say this? And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected, and be killed. And then, well, that's it. He just dies. No rising again. That's a reward. And he said to them, if anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who will lose their life, well, they're really going to lose it. Well, though the logic of this would follow. In other words, we've eliminated the reward in both of these texts. I think we would all agree something's amiss, right? Why this syllogism doesn't work is worth thinking about. It's true, the cruciform life will be rewarded. But as every reader intuitively knows, the issue at stake, certainly when we're looking at Mark 8, is not the reward per se, but the type of vocation Jesus is proposing. Peter thinks that the way to be the Messiah is to go forth bravely, perhaps even brazenly, and grab what's rightfully yours. Jesus, however, inverts this paradigm. The way to embody the vocation of God's elect is to offer one's life back to God out of love, trusting that through this act of self-offering, what is one's rightful inheritance will be realized. And herein resides really my primary point for this evening. The issue here is not how I can achieve greatness, but rather what kind of world is it that God has made? And on the basis of answering that question, how might I flourish in such a world? The presumption is that only when we've grasped what type of world we live in can we figure out a strategy for flourishing in it. That's why I want to suggest that the teaching about the treasury in heaven is as much metaphysical as it is moral. Not simply an inducement to make a moral agent do X rather than Y, but it's a teaching about the character of the world, and because the character of the world is of this fashion, the reward naturally follows. And so we have, I hope, the answer I posed at the beginning of my lecture. The reason that Scripture attaches a reward to charity is not so much to motivate the donor, though an element of that remains, but rather to make a statement about the counterintuitive character of the world God has fashioned. What kind of stuff is it made out of, and how might I profit from the way in which it has been constructed? Now, all analogies limp, but let me try one more. My wife was once in charge of a swimming class for adults that included a number of individuals who had near-drowning experiences in their younger years. This naturally led to an extraordinary fear of the water. Now, anyone who's done a proper investigation of the physics of water knows that the human body is buoyant enough to float quite naturally on its surface. But in order to exploit this fact, you have to be relaxed. And in turn, you have to trust the capacity of water to hold your body afloat. The more you fear the water, the more you'll tense up. And the more you tense up, the more you'll thrash about. And the result will be it's nearly impossible to come up for air. Because the students my wife had taught had been conditioned to fear the water, they could not trust its natural buoyant capacity. They could grasp the physics of the situation on land without any problem. But entering the water brought a whole host of demons to the fore. Knowing something and acting on that knowledge are often two very different things. And so we might say about the treasury in heaven. What stands behind this idea is a claim about the character of the world that we live in. To the casual observer, the world looks a lot like, let's say, the middle of Lake Michigan. It can be a frightening and very unstable place. There's a reason why the Greeks and the Romans revered the goddesses Tyche and Fortuna. Good luck was a decided advantage, so it seemed, for someone to flourish in a world that was indifferent to human beings. But at the same time, I think there's a deep desire in all of our hearts to affirm actually that the world, though it may appear that way, isn't actually that way. The world, rather, we want to affirm, was made through the principle of charity. And that's why Jesus, in this gospel lection, promises the rich young man a treasury in heaven. The point of the promise is not merely, or not even primarily, motivational. Its function lies elsewhere. It wants to teach us that in the long run, mercy will trump all of its competitors. Why? Because that's the type of world God has made and governs by His providence. With the gift of faith, we can learn to see the world this way as well. Charity, then, I'm trying to suggest this evening, is not simply about making things better on earth. It is that. But charity also has, at least in this sense, a profoundly evangelical content. The renunciation of wealth, to be sure, helps the poor, but it also reveals something about the essential shape of the world God has made and how we might flourish in it. Only in this way can we understand why Christian art would pair the Eucharist with charity. and just as we should not want to instrumentalize the former, so we should be wary about limiting the charitable deed to simple utilitarian ends. Now, some may be uneasy here and fear that I'm prioritizing perhaps a momentary feeling of pity for the downtrodden over a more substantial and far-reaching concern for constructing a more just society so that the need for alms perhaps would disappear altogether. Though such fears are commendable, after all, acts of kindness, no matter how virtuous, do not compensate for deep structural evils. In the end, however, what I've tried to suggest or want to suggest is that this perspective misses a crucial ingredient. For the deeper question I think we want to ask is what funds our interest in social justice in the first place? From whence comes this common sense obligation to help the poor as poor? It's important to note that this was not a specifically important virtue in the Greco-Roman world, and it's not always a virtue highly esteemed by modern libertarians. You have the Ayn Rand variety, for example. Do we then have, I think it's fair to ask, any guarantee that concern for the poor will remain a commitment of Western cultures once Christianity has fully receded, if it does so, into the background? My colleague at Notre Dame, the sociologist Christian Smith, has recently argued that concern for the poor, which is so prominent in Western democracies, had its origins in biblical religion. And Peter Brown's recent thick book, which I've mentioned on this subject, has provided massive documentation for the truth of this claim. Though thinkers such as Immanuel Kant and John Rawls have made arguments for why secular societies should retain these values, their arguments, Chris Smith maintains, always presuppose the moral virtues they wish to justify. It's like, Chris Smith argues, trying to move a stalled bus forward while standing within it. Well, this raises an alarming possibility. Absent the church's metaphysical claims about wealth, will the concerns for the poor which follow from it continue? Of course, that's possible. I certainly wouldn't contend that I can predict the future, but Christian Smith suggests a darker possibility. He writes this: sociological understanding suggests that beliefs and ideas require institutional resources to sustain. Values, categories, norms, and viewpoints do not operate like perpetual motion machines. Entropy is always at work. Alternative values, categories, norms, and viewpoints are always competing for adherence. And here, it doesn't really matter where you are on the divide, for example, of same-sex marriage. One can see, at least within that issue, an enormous social change in our own day, within the realm of simply a decade or so. And one, I think, on that basis can pause and ask, could such a change occur here with respect to a society's obligation to the poor? Continuing here with Smith, in order for belief commitments, especially challenging and costly commitments, think of the rich young man, to endure over time and space, they must benefit from institutionalized resources and customs to reinforce and validate them. Time and again in the historical record of cultural change, beliefs and values once prized have come to seem outmoded, irrelevant, passé, and not worthy of allegiance. For this reason, then, Smith concludes, quote, I suggest it's worth our reconsidering the necessary metaphysical and cultural bases of the moral facts and obligations to which we are committed now, while they're still understood and practiced, end of quote. Well, the story of the rich young man, I've tried to suggest this evening, provides the necessary metaphysical bases for the church's ongoing commitment to social justice. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions.
So I'll turn on the student mics now, so that you should be able to press a button on the mic near you and be able to talk when we recognize you for questions.
That's pretty impressive. So I just recognize this individual here, but maybe I was out of order.
No problem. You can handle your own questions. We're all set to go, so they will just go ahead and recognize them, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you for being here today. I just had one question. If you talked about the great potential of wealth and the ability to act kindness on this, would you say it's then more just to live a life in the pursuit of wealth to give away wealth, or one that lives more detached from physical possessions?
If I understood the opposition, is the more virtuous action to have wealth that you can give away, as opposed to having no wealth and not being able to give away anything? Have I understood your question?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. I've given this talk on many different occasions. I've never heard the question posed that way. Well, maybe I did it in an inverse way. I was once in a religious community in Brooklyn, and one of the sisters, I think, was deeply disturbed by what I said, because I think she felt, as someone who took a vow of poverty and had no possessions, that she couldn't participate then in the virtue I've just described. I remember being kind of shocked afterwards, not thinking that was my intention to say such, but I could see there was this kind of a pallor on her face, as though I had denied her the possibility of the salvation of her soul. So no, I wouldn't say that. So there is a privileging in the mode of charity as I've described it here in the biblical record of what one does with one's money. Because I think the Bible is deeply suspicious of the category of money. I like to think of, one of the reasons I like the term metaphysics of money is I think it's useful when you're looking at Ben Sira on the subject of money. It's like Lord of the Rings, the Ring and Frodo. There's no one who's so super virtuous who can be innocent of the potential temptation that money provides. There's a reason why Mother Teresa didn't want an endowment for her order, for example, right? She wanted to be every day to wake up totally dependent on the largesse of God. So there's a privileging of money because of the kind of character of money, the temptation to turn it into an idol, so on and so forth. Jesus says you can't serve God and mammon for a reason. But charity actually can be broken down into other types of acts as well. In the book of Tobit, which we didn't look at, the principal virtue on record there is burying the dead. And there what distinguishes Tobit as a virtuous man is that he fulfills this commandment, even though the emperor has declared that anyone who buries a Jewish corpse will be subject to the death penalty. So there we can see charitable action with respect to the burial of the dead having the same value as giving away one's money. So one could still have given away, or not, vowed never to touch money, but still be brought into the orbit of charity by their concern for those who died. I think individuals' concerns with their time, there's all kinds of things that I think fill fill this void, as it were, with respect to material possessions. We're talking about individuals who have taken a vow of poverty and perhaps are faced with this temptation on a daily basis. I think there are ample aspects of their personal life that could be included within the context of this commandment. Though it also recalls to me something that Gregory of Nyssa said in his document on virginity. He made the case that in some senses lay people had the potential for more virtue vis-a-vis life in marriage because of the terrible temptations of sexual attraction. It's a lot easier, he felt, simply to opt out of that altogether through a vow of celibacy than to have to live every day with the obligation both to raise a family but also not to abuse one's or one's sexual attraction. One could say the same thing with money. Perhaps the easy way out is to give it all away and not to be bothered with it. But the true test of virtue is living with it all the time and managing it in a way that's in accordance with the gospel. Again, maybe not to sound too Pollyanna-ish here, Ben Sira in Holy Scripture asks, who is it? Who is the rich man who's ever managed to stand up against the test of money? And the implied answer in the text is there is no one. So I don't know if that provides an easy answer to your question. It is a good question. It's a question the tradition asks. I think money is a temptation. One option is to give it away, take a vow of poverty, and obviate that from the very beginning. But I think there are other elements of the virtue of charity that come in play that an individual, even who has taken a vow of charity, can easily display. Was that at the heart of your question, or did I? I got a 2 thumbs up. That's good. That's a Facebook plus. The man over here on the right that I had dinner with, it's Mike, right? Yeah. You're Mike from Southern Illinois, do I recall correctly?
Indiana. I think a question to clarify kind of your overall point. So, is the general claim that you're making, if to the analogy of the floating in the water?
Yeah.
So if we consistently through our lives give alms to the poor, take care of the poor around us, that doing this, God will provide for us throughout our lives.
The counterintuitive teaching of Proverbs 10 is that the way in which you can, provide for yourself, the greatest security for yourself is through helping others. Yes, that's precisely what it wants to say. It's the larger point attached to that is the reason why that works. It's the reason why why people can swim. Why can people swim? It's not because you're a superior athlete. It's because you can exploit what the water naturally allows you to do, right? But you have to be. I use that example because you have to be taught to trust the water. Someone who's had a near drowning experience isn't likely to trust it. But someone is not likely to trust also giving your money away, right? That doesn't seem, that's not the world I know, but that's why the disciples don't believe Jesus with the predictions of the Passion, right? You're going to become the king of Israel by dying on a cross. I'm going to save my life by dying. How does that work? That doesn't seem sensible. And again, the reward in all of those examples is not to motivate a behavior, but rather to describe the way in which the world truly is. Yes, this woman here in the kind of beige or grayish jacket.
So I was wondering what your stance was then on the mega churches. So they have these billion-dollar or multi-million-dollar buildings, which seems excessively generous on their parts. What do you think of that in comparison to maybe using that money to pass it forward in their communities?
Okay, so I'm not. I thought I was following your question. So is your issue? I mean, so could we translate your question? Megachurches is one thing, but we could also ask, for example, should, for example, the citizens of Florence in the 15th century not worried about building the Duomo, but rather also giving money away? Would that be equally a valid question in your mind?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I mean, in the Christian tradition, there are people on both sides of the fence, and actually, if you look at the theses of Martin Luther from 1517, he's not yet a Protestant. When he's upset about indulgences, it's not indulgences per se that bother him. It's indulgences to rebuild St. Peter's. He thinks that indulgences for helping the poor is perfectly kosher. And within that frame of reference, he's still within an inner Catholic debate on this matter. And I personally think that building churches is a good thing, because I think churches are the place in which individuals are trained to view the world in such a way that one helps the poor. But I realize that one can be carried away in such an action and be simply interested or taken away by the wealth and be interested merely in material opulence. And many people who go and look at, of course, cathedrals in Europe aren't interested in notions of divine transcendence, but simply, corporal beauty. So that's a big question. I think the tradition has, has different voices on that matter, and I'm not going to solve it here in, certainly 5 minutes. Yes, the very back row.
Oh, okay. Well, you've talked a lot about monetary treasure and giving to the poor, and yet there are different levels of poor. There are different kinds of poor.
Right.
So I wanted to know where you stood on like stewardship, where the treasures are more in charisms or talents that people give to the poor, whether it's healing or forgiveness.
Yes, all of those things I tried to mention. Maybe I wasn't clear enough in the answer to the first gentleman's question that the character or definition of the virtue of charity, as we can see in Matthew 25, extends beyond simply giving money to the poor. It includes water to those who are thirsty, clothing to those who are naked, visiting the sick, visiting those in prison. These all become part of what are identified as the corporal works of mercy. What I suggested, though, or wanted to suggest, was that the monetary obligation rises higher in stature, and we might want to say prestige, because I think of the tradition's worry that individuals idolize their material accumulations. That's one of the reasons why it gets the attention it does in the Gospels, because I think Jesus understood when he says you can't serve God and mammon, that there is a tendency in the human species to conflate the two. And so the concern for individuals parting with their money to help the poor is a way of subverting the human propensity for idolatry towards their material possessions. Yes? This gentleman in the back?
Are you in favor of the rewarding statement? Because you showed us 2 slides. One where Jesus makes a statement of security to his disciples, and one without. Which one do you prefer, and why do you live by that?
So I think I'm not make sure I got the question. Are you referring to this slide here?
Yeah.
Okay. So the reason why the reason why I showed these 2 slides together is I think all of us would agree that erasing the reward in this bottom text would be ridiculous. None of us would expect that Jesus would say that he was going to undergo great suffering, be rejected, and be killed, and poof, that was it. It's all about just me dying. Like, well, then why follow Jesus, right? And the same thing's going to happen to you. You're going to follow me, and you're going to die, and that's it, right? How many people are signing up for that? Again, but the point here isn't the reward. The people don't sign up for that they want to lose their life to gain it. One would want to gain your life somewhere else. What I tried to suggest is in this bottom paragraph, Jesus is telling us something about the character of the world, that this cruciform sacrificial existence is actually the way in which God made the world. And the reason why Jesus is going to rise again is not as a means of motivating him to get on the cross, right? But it's telling you why getting on the cross in love for others or losing yourself for others will generate the reward it does. And that very same logic that seems so natural for us, I don't have to make that case on this bottom text, is exactly the logic of the top text. So the question is, why do I have to work so hard to establish it in the top text when it's so obvious in the bottom text? That's what I tried to show here. Maybe unsuccessfully, I don't know, but that was my point. And my point is at the top, and the reason why the Church Fathers had no difficulty with this, but moderns do. Again, remember that slide of Peter Brown. There are no articles, in spite of the fact that the Church Fathers love the concept of the treasury in heaven for exactly the reasons I've outlined here. Modern scholars are so bothered by the notion that we have no dictionary articles on this major theme. That's because the action up above, as I tried to suggest at the beginning, is charity and its vertical dimension, its metaphysical dimension, the fact that it's describing a world, not just motivating a behavior, has been wholly lost. And so we don't see how radically parallel these two things are. It's very much like that very first slide I showed when I went into the National Gallery of Art. All we see is Joachim and the Beggars. We don't even see the curator at the National Gallery of Art doesn't even see that the action is actually a bifold action. It's giving grain to God and giving alms to the poor, because the two are a single action. That's what I tried to suggest here. Let's see, maybe I'll go over to this side of the room. Yes, with the tie-dye shirt. Superman, are you Superman?
Well, no, I'm not, but I do like Superman.
Okay.
Okay, so my question is, why do you think that there is a lack of articles out there? What do you think has changed that has caused that kind of uncomfortableness with rewards?
Well, now I'd have to probably be a better historian of intellectual thought from the 18th and 19th centuries, which I'm not going to pretend to be. But people who have studied this, the very concept of altruism, generally traced back to a French thinker by the name of Kant. And I think it all comes from a radical reduction of the world as a world that was enchanted. Faber, the great German sociologist, described the condition of modernity as living in a disenchanted world, right? That it's a kind of closed natural continuum in which there's not a divine actor, but rather simple, natural, physical agents. And I think this had an enormous impact on the way in which the charitable act then is viewed, and the reason why our default modes then are altruism and social justice, because the action then is restricted merely to an intrahuman exchange. That wasn't the pre-modern way of looking at it. It was viewed sacramentally. When Chrysostom refers to the poor in Antioch as walking altars, he really means that. I mean, that's where you meet Christ, right? It's not simply making a better world, but you go meet Christ there. That gets just shaved off once you get to the Enlightenment and beyond, both in religious and non-religious, cases. I mean, maybe the best book illustrating this transformation, long book, but it's a great book, is Charles Taylor's The Secular Age. But, it would be beyond me to give a full genealogy of it, but that's in rough compass what I would say.
Maybe a couple more. You're working pretty hard here, so you call it, Gary, but
I usually expect like at least one angry, unfriendly question, but all of these are such friendly questions. Oh, is this the angry question? Okay, good.
Yeah, this is it. I don't find it convincing, right? And the reason I don't find it convincing is it does seem to me that when you suggest, as the passage does, that you will be rewarded, it does sound to drain something from the significance of this world, right? It's the suffering of the other person that one wants to rectify. Presumably charity will do that. But then to say that, well, in the long run, you're going to benefit from this by doing this. I mean, the way you're putting it makes it sound like, well, assuming for a moment there is another world, and that's where we're headed towards, and that world is the more significant world anyway, then these acts down here of my giving up things, it's not that big a deal, because what the whole drama of life really is at another level, in another world. Am I making any kind of sense when I say that?
I can see that. Actually, I mean, again,
I guess I'm concerned about a kind of bogus otherworldliness here.
but I guess that's precisely what is. I mean, it is and isn't here. So that's Again, it would be useful to go back and look at the proverb. Would be, another lecture here. But the way in which this proverb is applied both in the book of Tobit and Ben Sira, neither of these books believe in the resurrection of the dead. So when they talk about storing a treasury in heaven and delivering you from future events that Lady Fortune may visit upon you, they're talking in a very this-worldly fashion. And that's what motivates Tobit to take the interest he does in those who suffer, which is extraordinary. He's interested in those who suffer, but he's interested in those who suffer in part because he thinks that's the way the world is organized. It's not, you see this bumper sticker, practice random acts of kindness, which is at one level a nice thing to affirm. Just be kind randomly, just on every occasion you can. But the other way of reading that bumper sticker is that acts of kindness are simply kind of random events in a godless, Weber's term is Enselberon. What's the English translation? A disenchanted world. It's merely, my random, it's just an odd thing that I was born, I had the parents I did that make me care about those who suffer. Again, in the Greco-Roman world, this wasn't a virtue, right? Why is it a virtue? Why does it emerge as the virtue of virtues in the synagogue and church? It is because these individuals care about the poor, but they care about the poor because they think God cares about the poor, and they think God cares about the poor because of this, kind of metaphysical portrait, I've portrayed. The two go hand in hand. And that, I think, that's the element that's hard for modern, we would have to have a longer conversation for me to know exactly from what, points of bearing your question comes from. I think it's very hard, read the very last lines of Dante's comedy about love guiding the stars. I mean, for Dante, that wasn't poetic filigree. He really thinks that the universe is, and every natural action within it is guided by charity. And that's, in the end, why charitable actions will be rewarded. Because the world, though it doesn't look that way, actually is that way, right? That's what this stuff wants to teach. That the world actually is made that way. But we live in a world that is so disenchanted. We think that's like believing in the tooth fairy. The world is red in tooth and claw. That's the background noise. That's my background noise. I'm as modern a person as anyone else, right? That's the natural default mode. But the worldview described in the Bible, the worldview in Dante's comedy, is different. But it's a worldview that requires the eyes of faith to grasp, right? That's what Proverbs 10 is all about. That reward is not so much motivational, but descriptive of the character of the world we live in. I can't do anything better than that. But that's why the Christian church loved this image. That's why when Peter Brown writes his book, he says that this is such a major theme in late Latin Christendom. Why is it so important? It's not because they're just it was, of course, a kind of Marxian critique. They were just holding out notions of eternal life to these gullible, rich widows who were handing over money, hand and fist. I'm sure you can find people that still believe that, but I don't think that, certainly for Peter Brown, that's not what motivates these individuals. These people are compelled by an image of the world that was quite different than what they saw in contemporary Greco-Roman culture. It was the context of beliefs like this that allow Dante, at the end of the comedy, to describe the world that he does describe. And it's a counterintuitive world.
Can I put just a little spin on what you're saying?
Yeah.
Would another way of capturing what you're saying is something like this: giving away what I have to others in a very special way that
You are what?
I'm in harmony then with God. And I'm concerned forever.
you're in harmony. Yeah, I mean, it's how are you going to flourish in the world? You know, what kind of world?
That's the part I worry about, is the flourishing part. I'm less convinced that I am going to.
Well, you know, that's grounded, of course, in eudaimonism. That, and the worry about that, of course, is a Kantian worry.
Yeah, it is. But
And
it's a worry.
I think, yeah.
And it's also a Jewish worry. Yes, I mean, it's in other passages in the Old Testament. I guess I just wonder about it. Let me just say one general thing. I agree with your disenchantment view. I think we fear the poor, and we fear that we might become the poor. And that a great deal of our motivation with regard to the poor is precisely that. They're alien, they're different, we might become that. We're a bit frightened of it. But that would be another angle. And I think that's why we value or we admire so much compassion, is the acknowledgement that we might end up that way, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very secular way of putting it. I don't think it's informed by the vision of the Gospels, but I think it's an element of every individual. Everybody can share that feeling, and it's certainly part of what informs the ethics of, John Rawls, the veil of ignorance, for example. But I think that what's at stake in this material, again, that's why I say it's more metaphysical than moral. I think it's about living in an enchanted world in which the stars, the moon, the sun are all guided by the act of charity, which, Dante, one of the beauties of the Paradiso is that that's not a vision of the world that you just kind of fall out of bed and adopt. That's a vision of the world that takes him great spiritual ardor to attain. And that's what I think is beautiful about the section in Matthew's Gospel, is that it takes a spiritual ardor to see that this is how the world has been made, and if I want to flourish, I operate according to the rules and structure that God has established. Yes.
Okay, so you said that the world kind of, like as a universe, acts in charity with each other. Is that actually the case, like with the laws of science? I'm a science major, and it seems to me that it's kind of the opposite of charity quite often.
Oh, I think Dante would say the same thing. It takes a spiritual vision, I think, to see it that way. But no, the world looks, as I think Wordsworth put it, often, or maybe Huxley, grounded in a kind of Darwinian, description, red in tooth and cloth, right? It's everybody out for his or her best, and the strongest will survive. But I think that's a kind of natural. And that's also why you have the goddesses TK and Fortuna. But I think the Christian viewpoint is, however much the world might look that way, in fact, that's not the way it is. That's what Revelation teaches us. That's what the world's. The world is actually driven by love, and if you want to flourish in the world, those are the principles you will follow. But it is I think what this gospel lesson clearly wants to teach in Mark's gospel is it's not the default way of looking at the world, either in the pre-modern world or the modern world, but it is a spiritual gift to see the world that way. The world is given as divine gift. There's a nice section in which David Hart's recent book on God, he cites a chapter or an example from a metaphysician who talks about if you walked in the woods, you're walking in the woods one day and you came into a glen and a clearing and you saw a perfectly round glass oval sphere, you would obviously want to stop and ask, what is this sphere doing here? And you wouldn't be satisfied until you got an answer. To which Hart asked, well, the same thing could be extended to everything you see in the world. Why is this water bottle here? This pen here? Why is there something rather than nothing? Question that science can't ask or answer. Right? Where does the matter, the material, come from that science does such a good job of inquiring and describing? But where is the matter in the first place? Where does it come from? Is it just there? David Hart says that's a form of magical thinking, which some neo-atheists like Richard Dawkins want to contend. It's just there. Well, what do you mean it's just there? That's like that round translucent sphere in the woods. No one would say that. It has to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from God, who made everything out of nothing. That's awe-inspiring. That's metaphysical, right? Science can't disprove that. It can't prove that. But it's simply a question that every human being asks. Why is there something rather than nothing? Things have a certain giftedness to them. My existence is a certain giftedness to it. But that's a spiritual vision. One can make a philosophical argument for it, but the advantage, I think, of the narrative in Hart's book is it's also a perception of looking around the world, everything we see, and seeing it as a gift and responding to it as a gift. And that requires spiritual labor, not something that is simply reflexive. I got lots of hands.
You can take one last question, then we got to close it off. So your choice.
Okay, this lady in the far back here, in the black, and the braids.
I was just wondering what motivated you to write your book and how much research you had to do.
Oh, what a great question. You know, I can't remember how I came upon the thing, but actually what, you know, that text from Ben Sira that I showed you, Tobit and Proverbs, they were so, those lines to me were so beautiful. It's like coming to the end of Dante's, the paradise of the world, constructed by charity and motored by charity, which I agree with this young woman in the red. I think our normal way of looking at the world, cleared out of all, spirit fairies and nymphs, as Weber said, is very, unnatural. But you read the book of Tobit and Sira, and you see the world so described. You think of St. Francis, you think of Mother Teresa as individuals who organized their lives around such metaphysical notions. And I don't know, it seems incredibly beautiful. I remember as I wrote the book, I just felt like I wouldn't be worthy to describe it. I found it incredible. And what I think again is one of the reasons why money emerges as such an important category in the Treasure of Heaven, occupies a central place. Because again, I think if you watch the movie Frodo, Lord of the Rings, and you see the character and the power of the ring, that how it even the most virtuous individual, Frodo, is taken under its hypnotic powers. I think the Bible has the sense that individuals suffer the same temptation from worldly acquisitions, worldly possessions. Right? That they cast a kind of call of temptation that the concept of the treasure in heaven is meant to reverse. To think of our attitudes towards what we own in a very different fashion. Well, I think that's so it's so kind of chilling in a good sense. It sends a chill up my spine at least to think that is how the world is organized, and to live one's life as though that were the principle that organized the world.
Well, we are about to go back out into the world. Let's remember these words and thank our speaker, and don't stop for refreshments on the way out.